My name is Irene, and I'm 31 years old. Life wasn't always easy, but it was simple, at least for the first part. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other's business. My parents weren't wealthy, but we always had enough. My mom worked as a nurse, and my dad was a teacher. They taught me the value of hard work, responsibility, and kindness. We didn't have much, but we didn't need much. Our house was always warm, the food was good, and my family was close. I had a few close friends in high school, but I never really felt like I belonged to the popular crowd. I was always a bit more introverted, happy to stay at home reading or practicing the piano than out at parties. But I was content. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was more interested in learning, in getting good grades, and making my parents proud. After high school, I went to college, where I studied finance. I was determined to carve out a good future for myself, something better than what I'd grown up with. It wasn't easy. College was a huge adjustment, and at times, I wondered if I was cut out for it. But I pushed through, focused on my studies, and worked part-time jobs to support myself. It was exhausting, but I knew it was the path to something bigger. In my junior year, I met David. He was a senior at the time, and we had a few classes together. At first, he seemed out of my league, confident, charming, always at the center of attention. But he noticed me, and over time we became friends. We'd study together, grab coffee, and eventually our conversations turned into something more. I could tell David was different from the other guys I'd met. He was kind, thoughtful, and had big dreams for his future. He didn't just talk about success. He had a plan to achieve it. We started dating near the end of my junior year, and I felt like my world opened up in a way I hadn't expected. David encouraged me to pursue my dreams, to aim higher than I thought was possible. With him by my side, I felt like I could take on anything. It wasn't long before we were making plans together, plans for the future, for a life together. David had been married before, but when we met, he was already divorced. He didn't talk much about it at first, but over time, he shared pieces of his past with me. His ex-wife, Julia, had been a complicated chapter. Their marriage had ended painfully, and he carried some of that weight with him. But he assured me it was behind him. He was ready for a new start. He was ready to build a future with me. We graduated together, and David landed a job at a prestigious firm in the city. I followed him there, working at a smaller firm, but still in the same field. We had everything we needed. Our careers were growing. We had a small apartment that we made into a home, and we started talking about marriage, about building a family. It felt like life was moving exactly as we had dreamed. But then, things started to change. It wasn't sudden, more like a slow shift that happened over time. I started noticing things about David, things I hadn't paid attention to before. He was more distant, more withdrawn. We didn't talk as much as we used to. I tried to be patient, thinking it was just the pressure of work and life getting to him. But then there were other things. Late nights at the office, unexplained absences, the way he would avoid certain questions. It was subtle at first, and I told myself it was nothing. But deep down, I felt a shift. One day, after a particularly long stretch of days where we barely saw each other, David came home late again. His eyes were tired, and his movements were a little off. He tried to act normal, but I could tell something was wrong. When I asked him what was going on, he gave me a vague answer, something about work. But there was something about the way he said it that made me uneasy. That night, I did something I never thought I would do. I went through his phone. It wasn't something I was proud of, but I needed answers. What I found wasn't much at first, just a few odd texts and a strange name in his contacts. But as I scrolled further back, I found something that made my stomach drop. There were messages between David and Julia, his ex-wife. They were recent, and they were more than just casual check-ins. They were intimate, full of memories, and words that made it clear they were more than just ex-spouses. My heart sank as I read each one. It felt like everything I thought I knew about our relationship was a lie. I didn't confront him that night. I couldn't. I was too shocked, too hurt to say anything. But I knew I had to face it. I had to know the truth. The next day, I asked David about it. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't hide the hurt in my voice. And that's when the truth came out. David had been seeing Julia again. He had never truly moved on from her, and he hadn't been honest with me about it. What I thought was a closed chapter turned out to still be unfolding. When I found out, I was deeply hurt. Everything we had built together suddenly felt uncertain. The person I thought I knew, the person I trusted, felt unfamiliar to me. David apologized again and again. He said he had been overwhelmed, confused, unsure of how to process his emotions. He insisted that he never meant for things to become so complicated, but the damage was done. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. What followed caught me completely off guard. Julia, upset and emotional, began to place the blame on me. She accused me, publicly, of contributing to David's emotional distress. She shared her version of events, saying that I had manipulated him, that I hadn't truly cared for him. She called me things that weren't fair or true, painting me in a negative light. Suddenly, I found myself placed in a role I hadn't expected, seen as the cause of someone else's pain. At first, I thought things would calm down over time. I hoped that as emotions settled, people would understand that grief can make us say things we don't fully mean. I believed that staying calm and respectful would help ease the situation. But it didn't quite work out that way. What began as a few subtle remarks gradually turned into something more visible. Julia started sharing her thoughts online. She never mentioned my name, but the references were hard to miss. Phrases like, "the woman who came after me," or "someone who didn't really see him," made it clear to those who knew the context. Her words, though indirect, were enough to attract attention. Soon, people began to engage. The posts received reactions, comments, and shares. Individuals I'd never met started forming their own ideas. Even acquaintances, people who had once joined David and me for dinners and celebrations, began to drift away. Some stopped responding to messages, while others remained polite, but noticeably more distant. I could feel the difference in their tone, in their eyes. And then, the circle grew wider. Julia began reconnecting with people from David's past, former colleagues, mutual friends, and shared her feelings with them as well. It was difficult to navigate, but I kept reminding myself that pain takes different forms, and not everyone knows what to do with theirs. Even tried to reach out to his family, telling them that David had confided in her before his death, that he had been unhappy, even frightened. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, that she would take a tragedy, my tragedy, and try to rewrite it, bend it into something so twisted and false. And then came the letter. A formal one, from a lawyer. Julia had filed a wrongful death claim against me. I sat at my kitchen table, holding that letter, and felt the blood drain from my face. It didn't make sense. David's cause of death had been medically determined. A heart attack. Sudden, natural, nothing suspicious, nothing preventable. And yet here I was, holding a document that accused me, legally, of being responsible. I called my lawyer immediately, a woman named Teresa, I had worked with once on a professional matter and trusted deeply. She read through the letter and said what I was too stunned to say myself. "This is malicious." That word echoed in my head for weeks. I wanted to scream, to defend myself publicly, to write a post of my own, or call the people who had turned cold and ask them how they could possibly believe this. But I didn't, because the grief was still raw, and I was exhausted. I didn't have the energy to play defense in a war I never signed up for. So I focused on what I could do. I gathered everything, every message, every post, every screenshot. I met with Teresa, who calmly and methodically began to build a case, not just to clear my name, but to hold Julia accountable. Because this wasn't just gossip anymore. It was defamation. She had crossed a line. In court, it was surreal. Julia showed up in black, her eyes dry, but her demeanor theatrical. She looked at me like I was a villain in some drama she'd constructed in her head. She gave statements, presented half-truths as evidence, and cried, on cue. But the paper trail didn't lie. My lawyer presented timelines, doctor's reports, emails from David himself that painted a very different picture. One of love, of commitment, of stress, yes, but not at my hands. The turning point came when Teresa revealed a voice message Julia had left a mutual friend just days after David's passing. In it, she said, "This is my chance to finally get what I deserve." That recording played in the courtroom like a thunderclap. Even Julia's face changed. Gone was the performance. She looked cornered, exposed. The judge's ruling came swiftly. The wrongful death claim was dismissed entirely, and the defamation suit moved forward. Julia was ordered to pay damages, substantial ones. More than money, though, it was a public acknowledgement that what she had done was wrong, that I had not only lost my husband, but had endured an unjust, brutal campaign against my name. I walked out of that courtroom not triumphant, but relieved. Heavy, but free. I had defended my name, yes, but more than that, I had protected David's memory, the truth of our life, the love we shared. Julia had destroyed what little credibility she had left. The community that had once entertained her stories now saw her for what she was: opportunistic, bitter, and dangerous. People distanced themselves. Her carefully curated image cracked. She faded from view in the most poetic way, slowly, quietly, and alone. And me? I rebuilt, piece by piece, day by day, with dignity and without apology. In the months that followed, life moved slowly, like a city after snowfall. Everything quieter, softer, but still heavy in its own way. I went back to work part-time, just enough to keep my mind engaged without overwhelming myself. My colleagues welcomed me back with a kindness I hadn't expected. The ones who had gone silent during Julia's storm sent me emails. Some apologized. Others simply said they were glad to see me again. I accepted it all with grace, though I never forgot who had stood beside me when things were darkest. I moved to a new apartment, not far from the old one, but with more sunlight and windows that didn't creak at night. It was a small act of reclaiming space. David's things had been carefully packed and stored, not thrown out, not hidden, but tucked away like chapters of a book I wasn't ready to reread just yet. His watch stayed on my dresser for a while. I found comfort in the weight of it, the familiarity of its face, the way it ticked so steadily, even though everything else had changed. The settlement Julia was ordered to pay came through in installments. I didn't use the money for revenge or luxury. I donated part of it to the Heart Foundation David had once supported quietly, and the rest I used to create something in his name, a scholarship fund for students going into public service. He'd always believed in giving back. It felt like the right kind of justice, not just for me, but for him. As for Julia, I never heard from her again. Not directly. Her social media went dark. People stopped mentioning her name. Occasionally, I'd hear snippets from mutual acquaintances. She'd moved out of the city, tried to start over, wasn't finding much success. I didn't feel joy in hearing it. Just closure. The kind that settles in your bones like a deep exhale. One evening, I went to the park where David and I used to walk when the weather was nice. It was spring. The trees were just beginning to bloom again, that soft pink haze hovering above the path like a promise that winter didn't win. I brought a thermos of tea and sat on our favorite bench. A little boy and his father passed by. The boy laughed, one of those loud, unfiltered laughs that children haven't yet learned to muffle. I smiled, not a bitter smile, a real one. Grief, I've learned, doesn't vanish. It settles. It becomes part of your framework, woven into your story like a thread that doesn't match but still holds everything together. And when someone tries to rip that thread out, tries to rewrite your truth with lies, they don't just fail, they expose their own unraveling. Julia did that to herself. I didn't have to scream. I didn't have to fight dirty. I just had to tell the truth and let it do the work. The funny thing is, people often think justice looks like fire and fury. But for me, it came quietly, in the rustle of paperwork, in the sound of a judge's gavel, in the silence that followed once the lies stopped echoing. That silence became my peace. And today, I live with it proudly. Not untouched, but unbroken. Not without scars, but stronger for them. David loved me. That was the truth. And I loved him. That was mine. No one gets to take that away, not even someone who tried. I used to think closure came with a big moment, some dramatic scene where everything is said, all questions answered, all wounds neatly bandaged. But that's not how it happened for me. Closure came in fragments, in 1,000 quiet decisions, in choosing, again and again, not to let someone else's bitterness define my story. After the court case, there were days when I felt hollow, even though I had won. I remember waking up the morning after the verdict and staring at the ceiling, feeling both light and unbearably heavy. What had happened to me wasn't something a courtroom could truly undo. I had lost my husband. I had been dragged through public shame, through whispers and cold stares, and the sickening feeling of being judged when I had done nothing wrong. But slowly, the weight began to lift. Not all at once, but gradually. What helped most wasn't some grand act of healing. It was the small routines I returned to. My morning coffee with the sound of rain against the window. Sunday trips to the flower market. Something David and I used to do together, now done alone, but with his memory folded gently into the experience. I started running again, just around the neighborhood, nothing competitive, just a way to remind myself that my body still moved, that I was still here. I even found myself laughing again. It surprised me the first time. I was watching an old comedy with a friend, and there was a moment so absurd, so perfectly timed, that I let out this burst of laughter that startled even me. We both paused, eyes wide, and then I said, "I didn't think I could do that anymore." But I could. And I would. One day, while organizing old files, I came across a letter David had written me the year before he died. He wasn't big on writing things down. He was a talker, not a note leaver. But he had written me a birthday card, and inside it was a short letter he'd folded and tucked behind the card. I'd forgotten about it completely. It read, "You've given me a life I didn't think I deserved. You've made me feel safe again. Thank you for not running from my baggage. Thank you for standing beside me. I hope, if nothing else, you always remember how much I admired your strength, even when I didn't say it out loud." I must have read those lines a dozen times. Cried, of course. But not because I was broken. Because I was whole. Because I had proof, real, undeniable proof, that I had been loved deeply, and that I had done right by the man I married. And whatever Julia had tried to say, whatever narrative she had tried to spin, couldn't erase that truth. One evening, I got coffee with an old colleague who had distanced herself during the storm and had since reached out to reconnect. "Over oat lattes and banana bread," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. I should have stood up for you. I let the noise get in my head." I appreciated the apology, even though I hadn't needed it. "I get it," I told her. "People believe what they want when the truth feels inconvenient." She nodded. "Still, you handled it with so much grace." I smiled, not out of pride, but out of something calmer, something settled. "I didn't have a choice," I said. "But if I did, I would have chosen the same way. Because I didn't burn anything down. I didn't scream back or sling mud. I just told the truth and let time do what it always does, reveal everything. And now, when I walk into rooms where people once looked at me with suspicion, I hold my head high. Not because I need their approval, but because I've earned my peace. My name is Irene. I lost my husband. I was lied about, judged, and nearly broken. But I survived it all with my dignity intact. And I live now with the quiet power of someone who knows. You don't have to be loud to be right. You don't have to fight dirty to win. You just have to stand firm in the truth and let the lies crumble all on their own." About a year after the court ruling, I found myself driving past the courthouse on a warm spring afternoon. The windows were down, and the scent of freshly cut grass drifted in on the breeze. I hadn't meant to go that way. It was just part of a detour I took to avoid traffic. But as I sat at the red light across from the building where so much of my pain had once gathered, I realized something surprising. I didn't feel anything. No spike of anxiety, no rush of anger, just stillness. And in that stillness, I recognized how far I'd come. There was a time when just the mention of Julia's name would tighten something in my chest. A time when the thought of strangers judging me based on lies would keep me awake at night. But all of that had faded. Not forgotten, no. I don't believe in erasing chapters, no matter how ugly they were. But the pain no longer held the pen. It had taken everything in me not to become what she said I was. Not to let the weight of her accusations deform the truth I carried. But I hadn't. I had stayed upright, even when the world bent around me. And now, I was free. Not just legally, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. I pulled away from the courthouse and didn't look back. Around that same time, I started seeing someone new. His name is Alex. We met through mutual friends at a gallery opening. I wasn't looking for anything serious. I wasn't even sure I was ready, but he was patient in a way I didn't expect. He asked questions, real ones, the kind that told me he wasn't just interested in the surface. He wanted to understand what shaped me. Eventually, I told him about David, about Julia, about everything. He didn't flinch. He didn't try to fix it. He just listened. And then he said something I'll never forget. Sometimes, surviving something like that, it makes you more you than ever before. And he was right. The woman I am now is stronger, not in a hardened way, but in a knowing way. I know what grief feels like, what betrayal feels like. I know how to stand in a storm without losing my footing. I know the cost of silence and the power of truth. Most of all, I know myself. That's what Julia never understood. She tried to define me by her resentment, her jealousy, her anger, but I was never hers to define. And no matter how loudly she screamed, the truth whispered louder in the end. Now, when people ask me about that chapter of my life, I don't hide it. I tell it honestly, not to relive the pain, but to show what healing can look like. That justice, even when delayed, is still worth fighting for. That dignity doesn't always roar. It often stands quietly in the corner, unshaken. I still visit David's grave every now and then. I bring fresh flowers, sit on the bench nearby, and talk to him like I used to. I tell him about my life, about work, about Alex, about how, despite everything, I'm okay. And I imagine him smiling, maybe even saying, "I knew you would be." And that's enough. I don't need revenge stories. I don't need people to pick sides. I just need the truth. And now it belongs to me again.